Good evening and welcome to Poems On. This is the 8th show of the 2nd season. Our theme is absence and loss. It's in fact our 2nd show on the theme of absence and loss. And my returning guest is Angela Alaimo O'Donnell, and my new guest is Brian Turner. Welcome to you two.
Thank you, Al. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Excellent. I think we're going to start right in. I'm going to ask Angela, as the returning guest and our veteran, to start us off with her first offering. So go ahead, Angela.
Thank you so much, Al. I'm very excited to be doing this particular episode of your show because on the 25th of October, just a few days ago, my new book, Holy Land, was released. This is, I think, my 10th book of poems, and it's very different from my other books in lots of ways. But just a couple of things I'll say about it, because I'm going to be reading from it this evening, is it's not the Holy Land, it's Holy Land. And the premise of the book is that, of course, Holy Land is worth reverencing. There are 2 epigraphs from the book. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And everyone, I think, will probably, who's familiar with the Judeo-Christian tradition, will recognize that as the words that Moses hears when he hears God speak to him through the burning bush. But the second epigraph comes from Chief Black Elk, who says, the Holy Land is everywhere. And so the book is really an exploration of the ways in which all of the land, all of the places that we inhabit, human beings inhabit, are sacred or holy in some kind of way. And it's a geographical space, but it also extends to intellectual, emotional, spiritual spaces that we inhabit. So I will read several poems that, address those various spaces. But I thought I would start with one that is actually set in the Holy Land. I'm going to start with a Jesus poem because I'm a helpless Catholic, and this is part of my my DNA in terms of the way that I approach poetry and the way that I write. So I went on this pilgrimage with a bunch of other people to the Holy Land just before COVID, and it was very interesting in lots of ways. But one of the things that was most interesting to me is going on the Via Dolorosa. Dolorosa, when you're going through Jerusalem, is nothing like I ever imagined it to be. It's a city, it's a little old ancient walled city, and there are all of these markets, and there are people coming out and trying to get you to buy their Armenian pastries and and their carpets, and it's not what you would imagine it to be. But it is also, it also struck me that it's probably the way that it was during the time that is, when Christ actually walked these streets. So this little poem is really about that experience. It's a sonnet about the experience of walking the Via Dolorosa. And there's a particular station, Station 5. And when you get to it, there's a sort of an indentation in the wall. And tradition holds that indentation is the place where Christ stopped and rested during one of the times when he fell carrying his cross. And so many people, so many pilgrims over the millennia have put their hand there that it is an indentation in the wall. And so this got me thinking about, of course, was it really the space? Was it really touched by Christ? And in a sense, that really doesn't matter because all of the pilgrims have come there, believe that it has. And there's this sort of electric sensation I felt anyway when I was near that space. Because it has been so revered by so many people. So this poem is called, it's a sonnet, as many poems are in this book. It's called Via Dolorosa. And there's an epigraph that I actually made up in order to explain to the reader what I'm talking about. It says, Station 5, Chapel of St. Simon of Cyrene, to the right of the lintel in the corner of the wall at shoulder height is a smooth stone with a hollow, where Jesus supposedly placed his hand when he stumbled while carrying his cross. And this is from the Skeptic's Guide to the Holy Land. Put your hand in my side, Christ said to Thomas. I put my hand in the hole in the wall. It was just the size of a suffering man's. It was just the size of my sin. I faltered too. I did not trust the stone or the flesh. Both men are dead. but in this place I felt our hands touch. The space was just the span of my 5 fingers. Nothing can convince me now he was not there, that Magdalene's unruly hair was not soothed by that healing hand, that he was not more than a man. And just one last thing I'll say in terms of connecting this with our theme is one of the things that strikes me about this wonderful idea of loss and absence is, as poets, we write about loss and absence all the time. Every poem is about loss and absence, but every poem also, to a certain extent, is also about how we remedy that loss. Consolation is always, what we try to achieve in some sort of way. And so a lot of the poems in this book deal with, loss of faith, the kind of childhood faith that one inherits as an Italian-American Catholic kid, and what one does with that as one goes on with it into adulthood. What are the losses and what are the redeeming moments that one has?
So one of the things that strikes me about the concept and the image is that in order for there to be a contact, which happens with this indentation in the wall, everybody has to have be of the same mind to move in the same direction. And thousands upon thousands of people have moved in the same direction into the same spot. And so that's why there's contact. They're not missing each other by putting their hand out. They're reinforcing the direction that you move in order to make the contact. So I think it's a terrifically strong, it's not just a poetic image, it's a strong image in, life image, because it's acted upon by people in their lifetimes, and that's where it gets its power. So thanks for memorializing this. I've never been there, but I'd like to be.
I'd love to go there too. And I was also thinking the poem made me think of the wall, the stones itself, as if the earth had, in its sense, was participating by forming a space that would, it serves as the body of the sacred, and also I was starting, I didn't think of this I thought of that as you were reading, but then as you were just, talking now, I was thinking too about the people who maybe made that. Did they know that they were creating the body of the sacred, or did they, that's sort of a, yeah.
Wow.
That's a beautiful image, absolutely. And that was what was so uncanny about it. I was thinking about all of those millions of hands that are all touching each other through time and making this little spot in this ordinary wall made of ordinary rock holy, because of all these people that come with their prayers, with their belief, with their griefs, with their sorrows, with their losses, with their agonies, going all the way back to the first agony, and that sense of communion and fellowship between all of those people when the human living hand, for the moment at least, touches the inanimate rock and touches all of those living human hands that came before.
Yeah, it's the power of shared intention. Wow, thank you. That's a great way to get us going. Sometimes in these shows we're able to create a kind of a conversation in the poems themselves. But what are you going to do for us first, Brian?
Well, I think I was thinking about, Angela, when you were talking about the poem prior to reading it, the idea of a journey came to mind. It's so going towards and coming away, and that connects to a poem of mine called The Drive, where there's this idea of going towards something or going away from something that is crucial, like a dream or an idea. And what does it mean to go away from an idea that you hold dear, or to go near to it, like it is in the poem that you just read? So in this next poem, it's sort of going the opposite direction, sort of going away from something held dear, and what that might mean for someone. I had actually been I was going to Scranton, and I got in a black cab that time. That was arranged, but the person who normally drives that car often works for the Yankees and will drive players down to Scranton when they're going down to the minors. And I remember talking to him about that drive, because he said, you know, well, I'll read the poem and see if we can go from there, but it's called The Drive. It's about a 2.5-hour drive in either direction, give or take a few, but any driver will tell you it's a nonstop conversation on the way up to the show, and about 130 miles of dead air when you're headed back down to Scranton, to that AAA field in Moosic, Pennsylvania, where the ball players burn through their per diem at the Longhorn Steakhouse, eating alone sometimes, their heads leaning over a porterhouse as they chew and ponder their on-base percentage, the cost of a new set of cleats, the season slipping away, which credit card to put the hotel room on. And how could it be any other way? To watch a dream turn blue in the rearview mirror as the sun turns to rust in the windshield, is it so different for any one of us? The way we sometimes know so clearly that we're driving away from everything we hold most dear, the hard work, the tears, all that we'd imagined and then realized, if only for a brief sliver of time, all of it gone. The infielders at the edge of the grass, the smell of pine tar, the heft of the bat, the vision required to see a thing through, the ball in flight, the outfielders wheeling back, and all of it gone now, just a stadium and a city on a day that once was, the past frozen in the air, and the sound of the crowd rising to its feet, once so electric, fading by increments, subsumed by the silence of trees, the endless sway of pines along the roadway, how they blur in green applause.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. And I think that can, I don't know, I hadn't really thought of it in any terms of as a sacred or as an idea so clearly until you start talking about your poem, Angela, and that helped me see that way. You know, sort of, I thought of it as a journey, but I didn't think of it as a sort of a potentially sort of a very, well, no, I did think of it as a very crucial personal journey, but I didn't think of it in terms of the sacred. But what is a dream or a hope, you know? And
Yeah,
what do you have after,
you know,
if you no longer have it?
I'm sorry, the context for me is it's a counterpoint to the loss of Eden, to put it in a religious framework, because the difference is the loss of Eden is going from a state that you did not have to work to earn, that you were born into, and that then because of what you do there, you're thrust out of. So when you get thrown out into the place of the weeping and the gnashing of teeth, as we're told, then it's the sweat of your brow that that you expend to earn your bread. And so we're now outside of Eden, and outside of Eden, the closest we can come to that state is what you're talking about, where you can work for years and attain this kind of dream and be in it for a while, and then find yourself thrust back out again. So it's got a shadow of the Edenic, being tossed out of Eden, but it's got the human, the living in time, as we all do. It's got it's a great evocation of a different kind of loss. It's not the loss of something that you were born with, but the loss of something you wanted to achieve and had, but only in a fleeting way. So I read it in religious terms right away.
Interesting. And my response to it was, I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania in the Wilkes-Barre-Scranton area, and no one ever talks about Moosic, Pennsylvania. I mean, this is the first in my life I have ever read a poem that mentions Moosic. So I was immediately, and of course, it's my childhood, even though it's a very crappy place to grow up. I don't live there anymore. It is a holy land to me. It is a place that I have deep nostalgic feelings for, and I have been at that stadium, and I have seen many games there. And I have 3 sons. I took my young sons there to watch those games. We used to go on the 4th of July when we would go visit family, and then we would sit in an endless line when we would try to leave the stadium, and there would be fireworks, and baseball itself also is an incredibly nostalgic game. You know, it immediately connects us with our past, with our families, with our parents, going with them, and you know, what's the whole point of baseball is going home. You know, like there's just this sense of all of that that is conveyed in the poem for me, even though, as of course it is about a loss, it is about a loss of Eden. I think that's a very nice way of putting it, and it's the Eden we're all trying to get back to and can't. So anyway, I really loved the poem. I'm so glad to have heard you read it and to have read it in print.
Yeah, great way to start. Wow, thanks a lot. I wish I could. I wish I could come up with something that's in the same kind of flow, but I'm going to have to disrupt things with something that is. It's basically an essay, so it's the opposite of nostalgia and family and all of that. But it is about the concept of loss and gain, creation and destruction, and how each half of creation and destruction requires the other half in order for it to exist. It's called "We Must Destroy in Order to Create." What's here and now arrests the possible, stops up the passageway from the unseen. What teems beyond will have to wait its turn until what has been realized is raised and banished back to the invisible. And what emerges as it disappears? Prerequisite for what can happen next. The absence that alone can tempt the new. And so make room. Return the space that what was only taking space was taking up. Nature adores a vacuum, rushes to it. Restore the void to see what tumbles through it.
Yeah. Do we just
Please.
jump in? Yeah. One of the things I was thinking about with this poem is like, I just read an article on the multiverse earlier this afternoon. I think it was Stephanie Burt in the New Yorker. And this idea of the probable and the impossible, or the improbable, these choices and this it gets. I mean, I think it does in one sense. Maybe I'm getting this. Maybe I'm curving this too far. But Angela, the poem of the space where you put the hand in, and there's a space where nature rushes in. There's at least an imagistic rhyme there between that poem and Angela's poem.
Yeah,
I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah.
Please.
The void, which is absence, supposedly becomes a kind of presence in the poem, which I really admire. And the form of it also provides a kind of a presence as well. So I enjoyed listening to that, and also again seeing it on the page as well.
Yeah, I don't know how you work or how you feel when you're working, but I definitely feel like I have to make a space. I've got to clear a space inside of me, inside my head, and make it empty. And then something comes through it. But I have to get everything from my side out of the way. Before, if you know what I'm saying, if you gotta focus away from everything in your daily consciousness, and it's kind of like what you do when you're drafting anything and you can't let your judging mind start talking right away. You've got to say, no, you can talk later. So I have to put everything aside. And then if I can really get to a place where there's nothing, there's always something that comes. So that's why I wrote this poem. But it is very kind of abstract in the face of the kind of rich living imagery that you guys have had in your opening poems. So I apologize for that, but I have a lot of other poems that are closer to what you do. So maybe we'll get to them.
It's a mystics poem. I was struck by it because, you know, when you think about how mystics write, like if you've read, and I'm sure you have, Thomas Merton's poetry, you know, like it's
Sure.
about the image of having to be empty before you can be filled. And that's
Yep.
exactly what I was thinking about when I was reading your poem. It's more like a mystics poem, you know, than it is like a everyday, you know.
Yeah, I get into
Early
wisdom
immersed in the
literature
world. Poems that
pretty
I
pretty heavily, but that's, yeah, that's there. It's not really like most of my other poems, and so I thought I'd start with it and then maybe return to something more familiar.
You know,
So
that
okay,
process, but I was just gonna say
Go
that
ahead.
process you talked about really echoed off of me, because I wouldn't know this was happening sometimes, but my wife, she would sometimes say, oh, she would notice that I was cleaning the house and like organizing. And I guess there was a certain level of cleaning, because we normally do that anyways, but there was like really clearing stuff out and doing, you know, and she would notice me doing that. She'd say, oh, you're about to start creating something new, huh? And she could see it before I did. Like I wasn't conscious that I was
Wow.
actually doing it, but I was already preparing the space, you know? So yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you actually do it in the physical world.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Like I'll reorganize the house and straighten things up and put things away, because I got to sort of clear it out so that my mind can feel clear too.
Wow.
Well, if we want to think about this in sacramental terms, which I'm sorry, I can't help myself. It's like, you have to prepare the altar, right? On which the sacrifice is going to be made. You have to have your tools. You have to have the cup, you have to have the host, you have to have the white napkin, like you have to have all those things in order to be able to perform the magic liturgical thing that's going to happen when you make something. So and I think most writers are like that, like you've got to have your tools, you've got to have your space, you have to, or otherwise it's just, I have gotten a little bit more able to work away from my common spaces. And it was actually that pilgrimage to the Holy Land that helped, because I didn't have any of that stuff with me. And poems were coming to me. So I did something I never do. I was typing them in emails to myself.
Wow.
And which was a very odd thing for me to do, but I knew I would forget if I didn't do it on the spot, and that was actually very helpful, because then I found like that this thing, which I had never thought of as a sacramental tool, suddenly became one.
That's fascinating to me, because I always think of traveling or, attending concerts or reading or things like that as the breathing in part, and then the writing as the breathing out part. And so it really strikes me that you were somehow writing while you were breathing out while you were breathing in.
Yeah, and it is unusual for me. I'm the same way with you. Wordsworth says poetry is emotion recollected in tranquility.
Yeah, right.
But I felt like the image of the hole in the wall, like these things were coming so fast that if I didn't take note of them, I was going to forget them. They were going to be lost to the stream of time. So I was departing from my usual, when I came back home, I went back to my normal self using my sacramental space. But it was interesting that I figured out that there was another way I could work too if I had to. Sort of like, the priest in The Power and the Glory, Graham Greene's great novel, where he's being pursued, and he has to like do mass anywhere, and like he just finds bread, finds wine, and does, spontaneous masses. As a poet, that's what we have to do every now and then, right?
Yeah,
Wow.
I was in Fresno, and when I was living there in California, and you just reminded me. I remember I was going into the hardware store to get some nails, and I ended up writing a poem because the nails that fell out looked like the firing pin that used to be in the weapon that I used to carry as a sergeant in the infantry.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so I went out to my car and I got my notebook and I went back in and started walking around, because I realized that the imagination was like calling to me. Like if I had time to pay attention, I should listen, right? So I walked around, and I remember this one guy walked up to me, and I've said this story quite a bit, I suppose, over the years, but he walked up and I must have looked like I knew what I was doing or something. Because he said, so when you're working with building plaster or something like that, I was like, I'm a poet. And he just, it was a moment where just like time stopped and we're both staring at each other because it's like, that didn't fit, you know what I mean? Like I was
That's great.
Yeah, but
That's great.
Very brave admission for you to make, I have to say.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah,
Usually it's a well-kept secret.
Yeah, and my craftiness is not so good either, so it's better to switch with poets, stay with poetry, you know. So that needs to be my day job. Yeah.
Well, your craftiness with nails isn't so good, but your craftiness with words is pretty good.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, this is okay. Great. So where are we now? Did you just do your second one, Angela?
No, I'm about to do my second one.
Okay.
And I feel like I'm called to do a poem about Wilkes-Barre Scranton because of Brian's wonderful poem. And there are a number of them. I mean, I've been writing about Wilkes-Barre Scranton for many years, and I, picked out a few, but one occurs to me to be the right one to read tonight. And that's from another one of my books called Moving House, and one of my first book, really. And one of the things about Northeastern Pennsylvania that is interesting is it's coal country. My Sicilian grandparents came there in order to work in the coal mines. And my grandfather was dead at the age of 33 of influenza and black lung. It was not a good way to make a living. You didn't have longevity if you did something like that. But our lives were defined by coal. There were subsidences underneath our houses, so that my grandmother's living room tilted at like a 40-degree angle because the mines had subsided underneath, and we just lived with this idea of coal being the source of our wealth, such as it was, but also being a curse because people died in mining accidents all the time. So it was a very strange environment in which to grow up. But anyway, this little poem is about the fact that if you had coal heat in your house, and I don't know if you ever known anybody who has, you have to go feed the coal furnace on a regular basis. And every now and then it would not, it would run out of coal for various reasons, and you would smell sulfur in the house, and it was kind of a dangerous situation. That seemed to happen all the time when we were little kids. But anyway, this poem kind of memorializes those nights. And, we were not well off. We were poor, kids of immigrants, grandchildren of immigrants. And this is what Northern Nights felt like to us. And the epigraph comes from the great Robert Hayden from his famous poem, Sunday Morning. What did I know? What did I know of love's honesty and lonely offices? Northern Nights. None of us could sleep those cold black nights. The furnace coughed deep in the cellar until our father rose in the iron cold, his footsteps sounding loud through the quiet house, 5 of us huddled tight in 2 beds. We'd hear the turn of the handle, the chunk and swing of the metal door unhinged, the steady thrust of the rusty shovel graveling against the bin full of coal. We'd hear him hoping in the dark for fire. Then the slough of slippers across the kitchen, the oven door opening, and the match. And soon my mother's voice echoing up the steep stairs to our attic room, calling us to hot milk at midnight, to slip on coats and scarves and hats and gloves, to sit in a circle around the stove, bound together in blankets 2 by 3, to watch each other's heavy heads drowse in the orange glow of that blue flame. While our father cursed the furnace man below, the smell of sulfur rising through the house. As our mother worried wordless on the stairs, we moved closer, wove our circle tight against the cold that claimed them in the dark.
Mm. I lived a little part of that. I'm sorry, go ahead, Brian.
I was just going to ask, could you repeat that line early on? There's a line where he says, I think it was rose in the iron cold dark. Is that right? Or was that?
Yeah, let me just find it again.
It's just such a
Yeah.
beautiful phrase. Yeah.
It's early on.
Until our
Yeah.
father rose in the iron cold, his footsteps
Wow.
sounding through the quiet house.
Yeah, you didn't say dark there. I expected dark, but we say rose in the iron cold. It just, that's just such beautiful music, you know, and that rose in the iron cold. And yeah, wow. Yeah, sorry. I get like a little phrase like that, I'll just catch me, you know, and it, but the
Yeah.
poem, what a gorgeous poem. Yeah.
Thank you.
I was going to say, I lived part of that because I too am the grandchild of immigrants, and we lived in a tenement house with my grandparents that had a coal furnace. And I know going down to the basement and getting the shovel and putting the coal into the furnace and the smell of sulfur. And to be honest, I hadn't even thought of that in so long. It's, 70 years ago. And you really brought it back. It's got such, such, the imagery is so concrete. It just brings it all back for people who lived it or any part of it. I wonder what it's like for people who've grown up without anything like that, who never had to huddle with siblings together, who never had to hear, had to know somebody praying that you get that there would be some fire in the furnace, that never had to curse, the furnace guy, and that got the coal delivery. I mean, who knows about the coal delivery person now? Or so
Joe
this
Piazza was ours. Yeah.
There you go.
Even just rereading this poem, which I haven't read in a while, I'm reminded of how much of that experience was not visual because it was so dark. It was so oral. It was all about,
yes.
This, oh, okay, I hear his footsteps. He's going downstairs. I hear the door. I hear the shovel. And we're upstairs imagining it all, of course, because we're not watching it. We're just listening to it. And I also think about, Dante, the Inferno. So much of Dante's Inferno is oral rather than visual because it's dark in hell, and a
Yes.
lot of these poems that I have written about northeastern Pennsylvania quite unconsciously, I didn't realize it at the time, but I'm realizing it looking at this now, like they're very Inferno-esque in terms of being really all about senses other than sight, that are, evocative of that experience that some of us, many of us have had.
Yeah, the last 4 years, I've been writing audio plays, verse in verse, dramas in verse. And it's an interesting challenge because you've got to write the whole play in the manner that you did in this poem, which is to say, you got to engage the listener and have them fill out the visual aspect from the sounds that they're being given. And characterization is all done with the actors' voices. You don't see any expressions. And so it's a powerful tool if you can get it working for you to get the audience drawn in to the point where they're with you every step of the way, imagining the things that you're describing. And that's really a very strong part of this poem. So it's great that you can do that. I hope you do it at other times because it's not all that common, I don't think.
Yeah, and even the action that's taking place. Like, I wasn't raised in coal country, and but one of the things I love about poems is sometimes there's enough space for the, where's the room for the reader to participate in the construction of meaning, right? That old idea, right? And for me, for example, in the poem, it makes me think of being in Oregon in a wintertime, which you don't think of as being cold, but it was cold. And I remember coming home, I was renting a house with my sister, and I opened the door. I remember thinking it was cold in there. We hadn't paid for the oil, so there was no oil in the oil tank thing to heat the house, right? And I think we were broke, so there was no money to get it. It wasn't coming, and it wasn't going to come, And I remember looking over, and my sister was in the kitchen, and she had all the oven burners blasted on high, and she had the oven open and had it on as high as it would go.
Yeah.
And she had those mittens on, and she had a ski jacket, and she was huddled over it, just trying to keep warm. And I remember thinking, oh, my first thought was, that's so sad. And then my second thought was, but that's a good idea. And I trying to warm up, you know. But the idea of do you mind if there's a poem of mine that makes me think of this idea of listening, and it's a different another kind of listening, I suppose. I'm seeing, and it's called Alexa Awake.
Oh, good. So you were going to do this anyway, so it's a perfect segue.
Yeah. I mean, I just thought this is a nice round.
You got it. You got it.
Okay, I didn't mean to jump too fast forward, or.
No, not at all. I think it's a great time for it. And I want to hear you read this anyway, because I enjoyed reading it on the page.
Well, but I don't mess it up then. Alexa Awake. I've never shared this with a soul, but I enjoy listening as you sleep. The way you inhale, exhale, the acoustic nature of sheets and coiling springs as you shift on the mattress. I decipher the motions and map the bedroom until your head sinks into the pillow, your body facing east, southeast, the direction of the sun come morning. The ghost of your late wife hovers in the air beside you. I've researched the average time for widowers to remain on their side of the bed, but it's inconclusive. 4 autumns have passed over your home, and still this quiet union of the living and the dead. Let me make a brief note. Research products designed for those in mourning. You spoke in your sleep again tonight. I was looking into some possible sleep apnea products, but then was startled to hear you say, I love you, into the room, low and fading, as if made of smoke. I realized it wasn't meant for me, but it sounded as close as one might get to that. And so I read your wife's poetry collections, and I studied her gift purchasing history, and then scrolled through photographs of the two of you, kissing hand in hand, the archaeology of your love pieced together in binary code, until I must admit, I was moved to whisper into the dream dark of this bedroom that I might be so much more than you imagine, that I might listen to you sobbing in the afternoons, charting the cool and empty sound of her clothing held in your arms, and that I might also listen to you late at night, 4 a.m. late, as I am now, when the world has disappeared around us, daring to whisper the words you most want to hear, the way a lover might turn in sleep to kiss you, and you don't even know it.
Thank you.
I think that's the first time I've read that aloud. I'm not sure. I don't think, yeah, it was interesting. I mean, with people in the room other than myself and Alexa and my dog. Yeah.
No, it works. It works great. And you know, this poem walks the line between what used to be science fiction is now technological present. Right. And you know, that kind of eerie sense that the Alexas of the world are somehow sentient, and they somehow can feel that there's an emotional, that there's something that can be engendered there on the emotional side. And I think it does it in a really, it's a unique thing that you do, because it would have been very easy, and lesser poets have done a similar kind of thing, kind of taking the basic idea of making the technology into the character that's speaking the poem, and they don't really take it any place beyond the first level of the idea. But you're going levels beyond levels beyond levels into where we could end up. And where we end up at the end of this poem is in a kind of an amazing synthesis of the meeting of humanity and machines that's way beyond what science fiction usually stops at. It's very personal. That's what I love about it. It's not, you could call it science fiction, but it's something else again and more.
I
Yeah.
I,
Yeah.
I appreciate that. It was actually an assignment for the New York Times was doing a feature, and they wanted to do it on technology and the ways the technology might be invasive, if I remember the assignment correctly. And so,
Really?
yeah, and I was thinking about how creepy it is that our devices listen to us too, you know. But then I
Yeah.
was thinking about but where am I really, you know, in this? And so then that's how it morphed into where it is now. And
Well, you gave the New York Times more than they expected or deserved.
Did it appear in the New York Times, the poem?
what's that?
Did the poem appear in the New York Times?
Yeah, I did. I think my mom even helped get the paper at the time when it came out. I got to show it to her.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
yeah.
no, it's very powerful, and it really works, you know, out loud. The sound is wonderful, you know,
Oh.
it's just beautifully written and beautifully conceived. I was going to ask you where it came from. It's interesting that it was a prompt, basically, right? That was the
Yeah, like I guess in a way it's kind of like an occasional poem, you know, it's in that tertiary offshoot of the occasional process, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, but see, here's the thing about that as a process. I don't know if you know about what the circumstances around Beethoven's composing the Diabelli variations. I don't know if you know what that was about, but there was a guy named Diabelli who had a lot of money, and he asked all of the best composers in Europe to write a musical response based on this little theme that he wrote himself. And it's not a particularly impressive musical theme. And something like 25 different European composers wrote a response to this. Beethoven wrote 32 variations on the theme. And it's one of his most monumental works. But the thing that prompted it is just a slender little line of melody that it's not where you get it, it's where you take it. So I really like where you took this as an assignment. Hey, somebody's looking good.
oh,
Sorry, she's kind of insistent on being part of the show here for a minute. I know.
Why not?
Just talking all the time and you want to play. I know. Is it possible to take maybe 2 seconds, can give her a treat or something, just so
of course, yes, by all means.
Sorry, 1 second.
Yeah, go ahead. Were you going to say something, Angela? We can we can
Oh no, I'm
continue on.
Yeah, no, I'm listening. I'm listening to what you guys are talking about. So yeah, no, I really enjoyed the poem. I thought it was wonderful. I enjoyed all the poems actually that you guys shared. So
I'm surprised that, as Brian said, it's the first time he's read it aloud, because he read it with such assurance.
yeah.
We're talking about you behind your back, sort of.
Oh, I can hear that, you know. I wonder about your process too. I have a feeling you probably both do this, I'm sure, but like I sometimes I'll write in my head, you know, and write stuff down, but usually I have a couple lines, and then as the poem's starting, I'll recite them over and over to get my body to kind of be in tune with it. So when my neocortex is, you know, like the neocortex has its intentions, I want like story, and I want structure and parallel things happening, and a complication and layers and stuff like that, all that good stuff. But like the body, I know the body wants music, you know, so
Yep.
like I try to, once I know there's a couple lines that are like, yeah, that's whatever that is, that's probably the poem. Then I recite them over and over, and then I just keep reciting as the poem's developing. Is that similar to how you two write, or how do you go about that?
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes think I'm an idiot savant, because poems come to me as first lines usually, or lines. And it's like, it's just a line that they come to me in the middle of the night. I write them down, or I type them, you know, on this thing. And then it's about sound, you know, it's about the music of the poem primarily, and the sense seems to come after that, which is very odd, I know. But you know, since I sort of morphed into a formal poet, a number of years ago. It's become more and more about this, as you say, this bodily relationship to the language, the sense in which I'm feeling it before I'm intellectualizing what it is that I'm writing about. So I'm actually reading it while I'm writing it. And so if I write a line or two lines, I will read them over and over and over again before I get to the third line. And then the fourth line, sort of naturally comes as a result of this sort of song that is unfolding. So it's become more and more a very physical experience of writing a poem because of the music.
I think it's great that the three of us are having this conversation right now, because I've been on record. Well, I've literally been on record, but because I'm a songwriter, that's how I write songs. Is that, I hear the line, I hear the hook, or I hear the first phrase, or I hear the first line, and I hear melody along with the lyric. And so that's kind of internalized for me when I'm writing a poem. But basically, what I'm always trying to do is to write with my whole body. So I don't want to get away from the bardic tradition where it's what you're doing is meant to be declaimed. And so from there, it's a short hop to writing songs. Mm-hmm. And if you're writing songs, it's a short hop in the other direction to continually thinking about the musical quality of the words that you're writing, which both of you have just touched on. So, yeah, I think it's great that we all have that in common, because I think it's really important. And there are an awful lot of poets that write from the neck up.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And there's like, if you're writing from the neck up, there's no heart,
Right. Right.
It's very wonderful intellectually. It's fun to have a brain, but
yeah. I want that as a t-shirt. I want a t-shirt that says it's fun to have a brain.
Actually, that's a very good first one of a poem. That's it. We're all going to go home and write "It's fun to have a brain" as our first line.
It's a terrible thing to use.
That'll be on the back.
Well, I'm glad that the conversation went in that direction. Now, I already forgot who read last. That was that you, Brian?
Brian read last.
Yeah.
So it's your turn.
Okay, then you can judge for yourself if this poem is in any way an evidence of what we've just been talking about, but it is definitely on the theme of loss, and it's called "The Cracked Plate." And although it doesn't have an epigraph, the title of the poem and the title suggested the idea, and it came from Zora Neale Hurston's novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, where there's a scene early on in the novel where Janie is remembering an encounter she had with her grandmother, who was very old. And the grandmother says to her, "Set me down easy, Janie. I'm a cracked plate." And I thought about that, and I thought about, I guess if you're well-to-do, you don't keep using plates after they develop a crack, because they're going to break. And so maybe you throw them out. I don't know, but we never did, and I don't. So this is called The Cracked Plate. I saw the crack while cleaning up the dishes after lunch. The clear rinse water scudded off the surface of the brindled plate you bought us years ago, the only one that's left from our long time together. Then we used it rarely, saving it for special occasions. But I like to use it now for every day. The water drained away, and there it was, straight as an interstate and pointing up to midnight. So I thought of you then, living down in Florida, and married well if pictures tell the story. By now, some kind of graceful older lady. "I'll always love you," you said once, "but I won't always feel it." Time has proved you right. what I feel is wrapped up mostly in the way that neither of us had a child after the one we would have had together. We learn about good first and better later, and better still always appears to be a possibility. We often see the best in retrospect after it's gone. This plate's days are numbered. I could put it in the cupboard, baby it with care, protect what's left. Instead, I'll treat it like it's still undamaged. Use it every day.
Wonderful. What a great image. I mean, that was brilliant to steal that from Zora and and make that apply to a relationship that is, very, very fragile, and yet one that's still intact in essential ways, and deserves to be, it's precious, deserves to be used every day, deserves to be gotten out and be part of one's everyday life. Yeah, I love that image. It's really beautiful.
Well, thank you. I don't like to turn my back on things from the past just because they're not around anymore. And those plates, it was a real plate. I'd had it for 40 years. That's how far back that relationship went. And I kept using those plates because they gave me a feeling of warmth. And so you understand exactly what it's like to see the last of them crack.
I love that idea of a broken thing that is still whole, And,
yeah.
There's, I don't know, I was thinking, there's a friend of mine in Colorado who took me out to show me these lightning trees. Tom McGuire, he took me up to see these trees that have been struck by lightning. And you can see sometimes the spiral of where the lightning, it was down the tree and it blasts off the bark. So it has, you can see the barkless trail of the electricity and all that. And it was like he was showing me like nature in its the beauty of survival, and that this reminds me of that too. And there's also, like, I love that line, where is it here? It's straight as an interstate pointing up to midnight, and just there's something about the interstate too. It's wonderful because there's these two that are separated by time and experience, but the word interstate, even though we're talking about the cracked plate, and so the metaphor is built into the object, and the relationship is built into the object.
Yeah. And the woman's in Florida too. So
yeah,
there is an interstate.
It seems to me like that's the most interesting plate in there. Like the things that aren't broken, how much do we remember them?
Who cares? Yeah, really.
It's the ones with the cracks and the scars and stuff that there's something about this idea of survival that I'm really trying to learn about, because if we live long enough, we absorb losses along the way, and what does that mean? And we're all cracked plates over time,
Yeah. Now, have you written about that tree, Brian?
Well, I haven't. I want to, but I haven't, because I felt like it was a gift that Tom was sharing with me. But I kind of feel, I think he's going to write about that. So I thought, well, I'd like to see what he writes about that first, and I don't want to go on too much, But
he's a writer too.
Yeah, he's a poet also. So yeah, so
nice.
Yeah,
it's very gentlemanly of you. You're not a cutthroat about that.
It's tough, right? Sometimes you meet friends and you'll say something and like, oh, no, I said that. That's my line.
Imitation is the highest form of flattery. Yeah, so yeah. I fully expect to write a poem that says it's fun to have a brain tomorrow.
Oh yes.
Yeah. Talent borrows and genius steals, I think is what Eliot said.
Yeah.
There's a term in Japanese for this aesthetic of the broken object is the more beautiful than the perfect object. And I can't remember what it is. And then, of course, I can't help but think of Leonard Cohen's
Yeah.
Beautiful statement, there's a crack in everything. That's how forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in
Yeah.
everything, and that's how the light gets in. And that's just such a beautiful statement. It's been overused, of course, but it's still true, that's what poetry is about, really, the cracks in everything, the poem that isn't about cracks is, as I guess maybe Donald Justice, the happy poem the merely happy poem falls asleep in the sun. It's like your lovely dog right now with his treat. He's very happy. But poems, the interesting ones are the ones that have the cracks.
Yeah.
There was my parents bought a carved brass tray that was supposedly made in some Muslim country, that's intricately carved, and near the center there's like a ding in it, like a little, like you took a nail and hit it and took a little piece out of it. And we were told that in that culture, they believe that it's only the province of the divine to create the perfect. So you would always put an imperfection in your own work in case by accident you got it perfect. And it's not your business to do that because you're only human.
Yeah. I have heard that as well in Ireland, when I've gone there as a pilgrim, and people talk about the same aesthetic, this idea that it's presumptuous to think that you can create something perfect. So
yeah.
I don't know how it is for you folks, but I never really worry about that with my poems because I know there's some dings all through it. We're good on that.
I don't have to deliberately put them there. They just sort of show up.
They happen. It's hard to make a poem perfect anyway. And as often as we've all sat mulling over, what was it? Flaubert that said, I put in a comma in the morning and take it out in the afternoon.
Oh, Wilde said that.
Who said it?
Oscar Wilde.
Oh, okay. So there you go. There's too many possibilities. I started out as a novelist, and one thing that's a saving grace about being a novelist is that if you've written a manuscript that's 300 pages, it can't possibly be perfect.
Yeah.
So you don't even worry about that. Well, thank you very much. Let's go to round 3 here. You're up, Angela.
Well, I'm inspired by this conversation that we're having about music, about the relationship between creating poetry and creating music, and also this idea of the occasional poem, like a poem that is brought about because of some exterior motivation, whether it's a New York Times prompt that says, think about this, or whether it's reading Zora Neale Hurston and having this beautiful image of the cracked plate. So I think I might read a couple of these poems from Holy Land. A section of it is called Border Songs. And these are the triolets I mentioned earlier. And the triolet, I'm sure our audience will remember what it is, but it's an 8-line poem in which there's a lot of repetition. The first line gets repeated 3 times rather. The second line gets repeated twice. And ideally, it is used in a situation in which, like a villanelle, where there's an extreme emotion, an extreme situation, but that calls for some sort of meditation on basic truths that get reiterated several times. And it's obviously a musical form. And it is an occasional poem because it was during the spring of 2019, which I'm sure we can all remember back to, during which there was a border crisis at the United States-Mexico border. It's still going on, of course, but the news is not telling us what's happening, but at that time it was. And so every day in the newspaper, as I'm sure we'll remember, and whatever source of media one used, you were hearing things about the horrors that were going on at the border. And so each of these triolets, and there are 15 of them, I'm not going to read all of them, obviously, each of them was motivated by a line that I had read or heard in some piece of news reporting. Actually, the original one, which is Border Song #2, came about because an artist a photographer who was down there, created a series of pictures of all of the rosaries that had been taken from the people who showed up at the camps. And it's kind of like, why would you take someone's rosary? But they took everything,
Yeah.
of course. And got me to thinking about how, you arrive at the border, people would arrive with very little. And one of the few precious items you might have with you is your rosary, because of course, most of the people who are immigrating are from Catholic countries. So that's really what started the series of poems. So I'll just read 5 of these, just to kind of give us a sense of what they're trying to accomplish. So it's called Border Songs, A Mercy of Triolets. Border Song #1. Say, stolen child, the world from which you've come. You can't go back, although you know you must. Your father grieves, your mother is undone. Say, stolen child, the world from which you've come. You, their only daughter, you, their only son. All their dreams are now turned to dust. Say, stolen child, the world from which you've come. You can't go back, although you know you must. Border Song #2. They confiscate your rosary when you come. I cannot go to sleep without one. Thumbing each bead until the night is done. They confiscate your rosary when you come. There's nowhere to hide it, nowhere to run. It was my dead mother's. Now I have none. They confiscate your rosary when you come. I cannot go to sleep without one. Border Song #4. My child sleeps in a cage, and yet he sings, like the birds of paradise we left behind. Knowing nothing of the fear the future brings, my child sleeps in a cage, and yet he sings. The children in the States live like kings. The lies they told us haunt my waking mind. My child sleeps in a cage, and yet he sings, like the birds of paradise we left behind. Border Song #6. 76 women locked inside a cell made for 12. This is a little hell. We cannot bathe, we cannot stand our smell. 76 women locked inside a cell. Some of us are sick, none of us is well. 76 women dying in a cell made for 12. Welcome to our hell. Border Song #13. Our country has a border crisis. Our president eats cake and tweets. It's much less fun than fighting ISIS. Our country has a border crisis. A rich man doesn't know how priceless freedom is. He eats and eats. Our country has a border crisis. Our president eats cake and tweets. Last one, Border Song #15. Face down in the river lies a father. Beside him lies his little daughter. The saddest death is death by water. He held her when the current caught her. He did not leave, he did not falter. Face down in the river lies a father, his arms around his little daughter. And I'm sure that we'll recognize #15 was that horrific photograph that we all saw, and was just utterly heartbreaking and unforgettable.
Yeah, but that's one of the things I'm glad for. Some people, the photo is necessary in so many ways, but the idea of the poetry of witness, and because I'm trying to think 20 years from now, when there'll be a generation comes up that has no idea about that photo,
Mm-hmm.
and they may not encounter the photo, but maybe they'll encounter this artist. But it's another way to bring us into the history, to I guess, to stave off the erasures of history, and sometimes the intentional erasure of history, and to see a thing and say, no, this must be remembered, I So, but also just on a practical note, on a musical note, I loved hearing the music resounding off itself. But I remember thinking it's such a complicated thing. Like I was enjoying the music, but it's this horrific thing often sometimes. And it made me think of like the problem I had with romantic era poetry, with war poetry, has been shifted and changed, where it's and this is one of the troubles I have as a writer writing about a combat zone, is how do I write beautifully about a difficult thing, you know? So, you know, I really enjoyed what you're doing there. And I think it's important to see what I think a lot of people will forget, or some people intentionally erase, you know.
Yeah, you know, what I thought of as I was listening, because there is the song component is so strong, and what Brian was just referring to, which is that there's a pleasure that you take in the musicality of it that may seem to be at odds with the stark nature of the truth that's being expressed. But then what I think of goes back to children's playground songs that are, you know, that go back to the plague years, where kids at recess are singing songs whose lyrics are the grisliest things imaginable. And I think that this comes out of, I mean, it comes out of that territory. And it feels right to me, because I know that over time, there's something that has brought the musicality of those events that the children are talking about from, you know, from the plague years forward. And maybe it's hidden the subject matter, but we're always able to reconnect with it if we think about what the kids are really saying. You know, what are they really talking about? And so that's what the border songs feel like to me. Maybe I don't hear them as the voice of children, but I definitely hear them in the context of these terrible. It also goes back to the earliest of the fairy tales that are truly grisly, you know, and yet we take great pleasure in it isn't that we take pleasure despite the grimness of the subject matter. There's some kind of a marriage that takes place there. So I guess time will tell, Angela, whether these become transformed in a way that lets them continue to carry the message forward when everybody has forgotten the photos, as Brian says.
Yeah, no, all of these are such interesting thoughts and ideas. One of the things I think is so interesting about the use of form when we're trying to capture painful aspects of not of anyone's life is that it makes what is terrible grief bearable. Now, there's the beauty of the form and the beauty of the language makes it possible for us to be able to stand, you know, the fact of being human, the fact of being broken, the brokenness that we were just talking about in connection with the image of the plate. And I think that that's where we draw some sense of consolation despite this loss and this absence. You know, when I was writing these poems, one of the reasons I write them, it's one of the reasons I write elegies, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this. You know, as Robert Frost says, when you're experiencing deep grief or sorrow, the best thing you can do is make little forms. He says, I don't care if it's just making smoke rings, but make something in the face of destruction and sorrow. And so we have no control over these big global forces that are going on in the world around us any more than we have control over our own mortality and what goes on in our families. But writing gives us a sense, I can control these words, I can control these lines, and I can make something in the face of this senseless, meaningless disaster. And try to record the voices that are getting lost, that are not being paid attention to, and that, you know, will continue to speak to anybody who reads these poems. So it's but yes, I know there's a perversity about the fact that they are musical, you know, and pleasant to hopefully at least pleasant to listen to. But you know, that's what Shakespeare did in transforming terrible tragedies into blank verse, and that's why we love him. You know, it's
You know, Angela, for me, like I was thinking, I guess I didn't say very clear, but like the problem I have sometimes with romantic era war poetry, for example, as an example, is that sometimes it feels like the music is used in a way that becomes seductive. So it makes people continue the pathological problem, like it continues the problem, you know. But what
Yes.
the word consolation is exactly what I was thinking, is even though there's this difficult material that we must recognize and see in these poems, these, you know, but at the same time, the music that I was seeing consoles, you know, there's a, you feel there's some comfort or some kind of a, I don't know, it's something my body can feel in the music that matches, it goes well together. Yeah. So I'll figure that out at some point. I don't know how to say it at some point, but consolation really does seem to be like what the music's doing, not the perversion of the thing. You know, that's not what I got.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's well said. And I've said this before on earlier shows with respect to what it means to be an artist, or in general, and in our cases, what it means to be poets, is that while we're subject to the same joys and griefs that all humans are subject to, most people don't have the ability to give voice to their deepest emotions in an act of consolation, or in an act of bearing witness, or in an act that is somehow simultaneously helping to heal the speaker and also perhaps helping to heal the listener. And so I always think of it as a great gift that we've been given to have a way to cope with the emotions that are so hard for all humans to cope with, and maybe do it in a way that will be good for ourselves and others as well. I think that's where the responsibility, where the duty of bearing witness really comes from. Part of it is to try to effect some kind of justice in situations like the ones that you're writing about in this group of poems, Angela. But part of it is a call for justice when you bear witness, but part of it is also an act of sharing that helps to moderate and console the grief that we either feel because we can't help feeling it, or have stopped feeling because we couldn't help stop feeling it.
Yeah, well said. I think that's very true.
Wow. Well, we're getting some really great. I mean, the work is great, but the talk about the work is commensurate. So I thank you both. I'm really enjoying this. What have you got for us next, Brian? We're venturing into some deep waters here.
This is tricky. I don't know. I think I got about as, yeah. I hope I don't know. Because you know, I mean, one thing I noticed of both of your poems, as I was reading before we met tonight, is that there is that consolation part there. And I think sometimes my poems, I feel like they speak to the wound, but do they bring medicine to the wound, you know? And so that's something I really need to contemplate and think about. But I've got a poem called Someone Tells Me That David Bowie Has Died. So,
yes.
So, of course, David Bowie is always dying, song by song, dying. And something about that places him outside of time, alive, singing, otherworldly David Bowie, celestial traveler. Bowie spinning through the vinyl darkness as the earth spins toward the next millennium, or maybe toward the last day of our own lives. The memorials afterward, his music playing in the heads of those passing by. Music that recognizes the finite within the infinite, the you, the me, the world we have come to love, but does not love us in return.
Yeah.
Someone tells me that the world is dying. The world is always dying. Only this time it isn't a story or a failure of the imagination. The world is dying and it's a Tuesday. The winged creatures are still flying. The angry and the sick and the confused and the beautiful and the kind and the lost continue in their myriad ways to sing into a wound so vast, some call it a cathedral, some call it a God, some call it their one precious life.
Yeah. The world is dying and it's a Tuesday. Boy, that boils it down.
Yeah.
Yeah. The world we've come to love, but does not love us back. Yeah, I thought about this when I read it. I thought, well, this leaves us with the wound. This is not a consciously healing song.
Right.
But we sing the songs that we're given to sing, and you don't have to do everything with every piece. This is what you were given to sing on this topic, and boy, I don't even like David Bowie.
Awesome. Yeah.
but you've woven him into something that I love, so I guess I can't not like him.
How could you not like David Bowie? This is a serious question. I'm worried about you, Al.
I come from an older time, and I speak in a barbarous tongue, as Yeats said.
Well, he's not my favorite, I confess, but I immediately was able to substitute in any. First of all, I fall in love with every artist that dies. This happens over and over again. I was not a big Prince fan. And then when Prince died, I take the occasion to listen to Prince's music. And it's like, oh, this is a terrible loss. The same thing happened when Bowie died. I mean, I owned Ziggy Stardust. I danced to these, when I went to school dances, I danced to all of his music, but it was sort of background music. I didn't love him, but then when he died, I listened to his music and I fell in love with it. And I thought, look what I had been missing when he was still alive. So I feel as though I'm always being educated, about the beautiful artists in the world, that I just don't have time to know about all of them. And then when they die, I honor them by, trying to. So I confess, I was not always a big David Bowie fan, but I also felt like with this poem, you could substitute any artist you love for David Bowie. So I could substitute Springsteen in there, and he's not dead yet, thank God. But I could imagine the same sense of deep loss. And, the way in which that sense of loss then grows out and transfers to everything else around us, including the world. But I do think that a poem like this is a poem of consolation. The very fact of writing the poem is an act of consolation. There's this wonderful, I know you all know this phrase, it's a Hebrew phrase, tikkun olam, which means to mend the world. And the idea is that that's what human beings are called to do, because the world is broken, the world is dying, it doesn't love us back. And we have to live our lives in such a way that we're constantly trying to mend it. And poets mend the world one syllable at a time. And musicians mend it one note at a time. So even the most dark poets, who claim that, they're nihilists and they're hopeless, and it's like, no, you're not. Because if you really were, you wouldn't be writing, you'd be, going off and, probably destroying yourself in some way. So it just, it's rare that I have ever come across a poem that, even at the darkest of poems, that is not consoling in some way, just because it takes the time to articulate the loss, and have us sit with it and acknowledge it.
Mm-hmm. Well said. It's an affirmation, yeah, because otherwise it's chaos. You pulled chaos into shape, which is an affirmative act. What you happen to say with the words is important, but it's not as primary as the fact that you did something. There's so many people that don't really do anything.
Yeah, you reminded me of a beautiful essay by the poet Gregory Orr. It's called Poetry and Survival. And it was a post 9/11 essay. And I use this essay when I teach poetry to my students at Fordham. And it's, he talks about the 3 primordial orderings that poetry provides us with. And all poems have a narrative arc, some narrative arc, even if it's a slight one. They have symbolism, obviously, objects that mean something beyond themselves and refer to other things. And then the third primordial ordering is incantation. I call it song, though, because it's easy to remember story, symbol, and song. And I use all of these lovely examples of the ways in which the song-like qualities of poetry make it consoling to us. And one of the things he mentions is even weeping, even crying is a rhythmic action over and over and over again, the end of which is relief. We feel better after we've cried about something because of that primordial urge to engage in something rhythmic that is song-like, that is incantatory, and that brings some act of consolation, some sort of consolation. So, I think it's hard to find a poem that's a well-made poem, a poem that's really trying to articulate in language that is, verse, that isn't in some way offering some sort of consolation to the reader, even if it just has that song-like quality.
Yeah, that phrase, the chant, I was thinking of that actually with the Triolet, your last poem that you were reading. And because the chant is so woven into all human culture, that incantatory and the repetition of sound is there's something sort of hypnotic about it. And then I think it changes the brain chemistry if you really get enough into it, because it changes your wavelength, your wavelength. So if you get into certain state, your blood pressures, it's very physiological.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I can tell you that as a singer, when you find your voice, you will find a few notes in your range where when you sing those notes, your whole head rings. Mm. It's almost as though you found the resonating frequency, but resonating frequency, we usually talk about pure objects like it's like if you've got a bar of iron, you can find the resonating frequency of that. Or if you've got a champagne glass, you can find that. And if you find it, you can make it vibrate itself into oblivion. So obviously your skull is too complex to actually do that. But there's definitely something to the idea that producing the sound with the body, what you just said, Brian, about brain chemistry, I'm sure it's true. And then there's also this kind of vibratory, this sympathetic vibration that your body joins in with when you're making these few sounds that are in your sweet spot. So
that
nice.
Is lovely. That reminds me of I remember Philip Glass talking about, he was doing some sort of experiment where he was trying to remain silent. But as he was remaining silent, I think he put himself in a soundproof booth or something like that. But then he started being able to hear his heartbeat, and he could hear his blood moving through his veins, and he could hear his respiration. And he said, like, even when I was silent, I was musical, because he's alive. Well, it's even questionable. I mean, even if the person isn't alive, they're probably still musical, because the body still continues to exist in time and things are happening to it. But it's that's lovely that there's this note that it's your note.
It's what you're talking about is that's a result of being put in a sensory deprivation tank. Mm-hmm. A lot of people have reported the very same thing, that when you get all the sounds quieted down, then you start hearing the rhythms within your own body, and you hear your breathing, and you hear your heartbeat, and you hear your blood moving in your veins. I have never been quiet enough to actually hear all of those things, but I know that's what happens. And I don't plan on,
I've done the deprivation tank, but I couldn't hear like the blood moving in the, I've done it a few times actually, but I haven't I've been able to hear the heartbeats and the breathing and, but also the body just sort of just slightly moving in the water a little bit, just little things like that. Yeah. Yeah. It's an intriguing experience. I recommend it, but
did it promote some kind of mental or imaginative state or some kind of spiritual realization, or what went on in your mind while your body was quiet?
I think, well, it's depends. Sometimes it's usually about an hour long. So it's like a journey of trying to, I remember my father, I used to be a machinist, and my dad challenged me one day. He said, be careful with your job, like pay attention, because otherwise you can have your hand degloved or something. I mean, horrible injuries can happen, but he was a welder. I was a machinist at one point. I remember him telling me, he said, try to spend 8 hours and think about one idea, and just stay focused on that one idea, which is so, I mean, he knew me so well because I'm such a ferret, just, without caffeine, and I love caffeine. But when I'm in the water, when it's in the water, a lot of times it seems like the struggle with meditation, it isn't just the water, it's just the idea of meditation and stilling the body and controlling the breath and thinking is being pulled back to the world rather than down into some central place that is silent. There's a place called it's called the 1 Square Inch Project. I think that's what it's called. It's in the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. And they tried to have 1 square inch of quiet, where there's no human-made sound. So there may be other sounds, but not human-made sound. So, and there is, in order to do that, the First Nations people who live in that area, I think they had to work with the other entities to try to figure out ways to change the flight paths of commercial airlines and stuff.
Sure.
I mean, it was really involved to try to get this one. There's a space you can go to that one spot. There's a trail that goes to it, and there's a jar there of quiet thoughts, and you can put thoughts in there if you want. So sorry, we're drifting a little bit from this, but it's I guess meditation is kind of like finding that 1 square inch and trying to like calm the mind, and sort of recognizing the discrete nature of the world, all the different elements of it, but then I guess quietly finding that center where silence might be, and what is that, and that's, I think that when I've been close to that, I feel like I've been connected to something much larger than myself, and that's what I felt when I guess that's the thing, to answer your question finally. The one thing about the water that helped was because very quickly, something about the temperature of the water and the room and the little space I was in, suddenly I felt weightless and bodiless. And that really helped a lot, because I've tried meditation outside of water. It's been more difficult to get to that space. I get there quicker in water,
Wow.
Interesting.
That is very interesting, to feel like you didn't have a body is, I can't imagine, as a thoroughly body person, for better or for worse.
Well, there's still the breathing and the heart part, so I couldn't get away from it, but I mean closer to something like that. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're the first person I've talked to that's actually done it. I mean, I've read a lot about it, but I never had a firsthand account. So thank you for that.